On April 2, 1992, inside a federal courtroom in Brooklyn, one of the most significant moments in American organized crime history reached its conclusion. John Gotti, the public face of the Gambino crime family, and perhaps the most recognizable mafia boss in modern history, stood convicted of racketeering, murder, illegal gambling, obstruction of justice, and multiple federal crimes. Federal prosecutors had spent years building the case. FBI surveillance operations, testimony from former underboss Salvatore, Sammy the Bull Gravano, and evidence gathered during the investigation, known as the Gotti case, had finally achieved what authorities had failed to do repeatedly throughout the 1980s. For years, newspapers had called Gotti the Teflon Don because prosecution after prosecution seemed unable to make charges stick. Earlier acquittals had transformed him into a public spectacle. Expensive tailored suits, carefully styled hair, and deliberate media appearances turned him into a criminal celebrity. But according to federal investigators and documented court records, the image concealed an increasingly vulnerable organization beneath the surface. As Gotti was led away, sentenced later to life imprisonment without parole, something larger than one man's downfall had begun. The conviction was not simply the imprisonment of a mafia boss. It represented a structural rupture inside the most powerful crime family in America. And almost immediately, a question emerged. What happened to the Gambino family after John Gotti went down? For decades, the Gambino organization had controlled lucrative criminal enterprises throughout New York City and beyond. Federal indictments and law enforcement investigations documented influence in construction racketeering, labor unions, illegal gambling operations, loan sharking, extortion schemes, and waterfront activities connected to Brooklyn and Staten Island. By the late 20th century, investigators viewed the Gambinos as one of the most financially powerful mafia organizations in the country. But organizations built around authority face unique dangers when leadership suddenly disappears. According to decades of FBI analysis and testimony from organized crime investigators, mafia families traditionally depended on carefully maintained hierarchies. The boss projected strength. Capo regimes enforced structure. Loyalty was reinforced through fear, ritual, and internal discipline. Stability mattered because uncertainty invited conflict. And John Gotti had built his reign around visibility. That visibility came with consequences. Unlike earlier mafia leaders who embraced secrecy, Gotti's public image attracted attention from prosecutors, journalists, and surveillance teams. Former investigators and organized crime historians later argued that Gotti's approach represented a dramatic shift from traditional mafia principles established by earlier generations. Carlo Gambino, whose name the family carried, had built power through caution and silence. Gotti often operated differently. The contrast would become critical after 1992, because when a leader becomes larger than the organization itself, removing him creates a dangerous vacuum. Court testimony and FBI intelligence reports later revealed that even before Gotti's conviction, federal pressure against the family had intensified. Electronic surveillance technology had improved. Prosecutors increasingly relied upon racketeer-influenced and corrupt organization statutes, better known as RICO laws. Long-term investigations had become more sophisticated. Informants had become more valuable. Most devastating of all, the code of silence had begun to crack. Salvatore Gravano's decision to cooperate with authorities sent shockwaves through organized crime. His testimony became one of the most important acts of cooperation in mafia history. Gravano admitted involvement in numerous murders and provided prosecutors with unprecedented insight into Gambino operations. Court records showed his testimony directly implicated Gotti and others in a broad criminal enterprise. But beyond legal consequences, investigators believe the betrayal struck at something psychological inside the mafia structure itself. Because organized crime authority depended heavily upon certainty. Men followed leadership because they believed protection existed at the top. When leaders failed, that belief became fragile. Federal investigators later argued that Gravano's cooperation generated widespread distrust inside organized crime circles. If an underboss could testify against a boss, assumptions that had governed internal mafia behavior for decades suddenly looked less reliable. And the Gambino family now had another problem. John Gotti was still alive. He had not disappeared. He had gone to prison. From inside the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, and later the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Missouri, investigators believe Gotti still attempted to maintain influence over family affairs. Prison restrictions limited communication, but federal authorities had spent years documenting efforts by imprisoned mafia figures to pass messages through intermediaries. The challenge facing the Gambinos became unusually complicated. A sitting boss remained alive, yet practical control outside prison required someone else. That situation created ambiguity. According to multiple documented accounts, leadership transitions inside mafia organizations often created opportunities for internal power struggles, faction disputes, and federal infiltration. Clear succession mattered. Within a relatively short period after Gotti's conviction, his son John A. Gotti, often called Junior Gotti, emerged in a significant leadership role. Federal prosecutors later identified him as acting boss of the Gambino family during the 1990s. Junior had grown up inside the environment surrounding organized crime. By the early 1990s, investigators viewed him as increasingly important within the organization. But circumstances surrounding his rise differed dramatically from his father's ascent years earlier. John Gotti had climbed through violence and public visibility. Junior inherited instability. The environment facing him looked fundamentally different from the New York Mafia landscape of earlier decades. By the 1990s, the five families faced pressure from multiple directions. Long-running federal investigations had damaged leadership structures across organized crime organizations. Convictions involving the commission case during the mid-1980s had already weakened major mafia administrations. The old era of relative insulation had begun fading. New investigative methods changed the battlefield. Hidden microphones, court-authorized wiretaps, financial tracing, informants, long-term conspiracies assembled through years of surveillance. The rules had changed, and authorities understood organized crime better than they once had. Former law enforcement officials later described an important shift in investigative philosophy during that era. Rather than focusing only on individual crimes, prosecutors increasingly pursued enterprise structures. The goal involved dismantling entire organizations rather than arresting isolated figures. For the Gambinos, survival required adaptation. But adaptation proved difficult, because another problem had emerged beneath the surface. John Gotti's style had created loyal followers, but had also created critics. According to organized crime authors, investigators, and documented testimony from former associates, some figures inside mafia circles believed Gotti's media exposure had brought excessive law enforcement attention. Traditionalists preferred secrecy. Publicity generated pressure. Even before his conviction, quiet dissatisfaction reportedly existed among certain members. Now Gotti sat behind prison walls, and the family he had dominated faced an uncertain future. Junior Gotti attempted to maintain order. Prosecutors later alleged he supervised traditional Gambino activities while navigating increasing federal attention. But maintaining authority under those conditions proved difficult. Surveillance continued. Investigations expanded. Pressure never stopped. Then another development began reshaping the organization's future. John Gotti's brother Peter Gotti started assuming greater importance. Peter had long existed inside Gambino circles, though never with the public notoriety of his older brother. Unlike John, he maintained a lower profile. Law enforcement knew him. Investigators tracked him, but he had never become a celebrity figure. That difference mattered, because after years of headlines, television cameras, and courtroom spectacle, invisibility itself had become valuable. And as the 1990s moved forward, federal authorities watched carefully. Because behind prison walls, John Gotti remained alive. His son faced growing legal pressure. His organization faced uncertainty. And inside the Gambino family, power was beginning to shift again. Power inside organized crime rarely changes through public ceremonies. It moves quietly, through meetings, loyalties, investigations, and pressure that builds over years. As the 1990s moved forward and the Gambino family struggled to stabilize after John Gotti's imprisonment, federal authorities watched an organization attempting to survive in an entirely different criminal landscape. The shift unfolding inside the Gambino family was not simply about replacing one leader with another. According to organized crime investigators and court records from later prosecutions, the family faced a larger challenge: preserving its structure while under constant surveillance. Leadership now existed beneath layers of legal pressure, informants, and investigative methods that had become far more aggressive than in previous decades. John Gotti stepped into a position prosecutors identified as acting boss. But unlike his father, he inherited an organization operating under extraordinary scrutiny. Federal agencies had spent years studying mafia command structures. By that point, authorities understood that imprisoning a boss alone often failed to dismantle a family. Leadership could continue through acting bosses, street bosses, intermediaries, and trusted captains. The government adapted accordingly. Investigations widened. Patterns of communication became targets. Meetings themselves became evidence. According to federal prosecutors, the younger Gotti attempted to manage operations while balancing two dangerous realities. He had to preserve authority inside the family, while also avoiding the visibility that investigators believe had contributed to his father's downfall. But the story didn't end there. By the late 1990s, legal pressure intensified around Junior Gotti himself. Federal prosecutors alleged his involvement in racketeering activities connected to loan sharking, extortion, and other organized crime operations. Investigations into his activities became increasingly aggressive. The consequences reached beyond individual criminal allegations. Mafia leadership depended heavily on perception. Historically, the image of strength mattered almost as much as actual power. Federal investigators and organized crime experts repeatedly noted that authority inside Cosa Nostra structures often relied upon confidence. Members followed leadership because they believed leadership could protect the organization and maintain order. Repeated indictments created dangerous uncertainty. According to documented law enforcement analysis, uncertainty could become corrosive inside criminal organizations because fear encouraged self-preservation, and self-preservation sometimes produced cooperation agreements. Federal strategy increasingly reflected this understanding. By the late 20th century, authorities no longer relied exclusively on catching individual acts of violence or gambling operations. Instead, prosecutors assembled larger conspiracy cases designed to map entire organizational structures. Relationships became evidence. Conversations became evidence. Meetings became evidence. The investigation itself had become a weapon. Within the Gambino family, another transformation slowly emerged. Peter Gotti continued gaining influence. According to court records and organized crime reporting from the period, Peter increasingly assumed operational authority as legal complications mounted around Junior Gotti. Unlike his older brother John, Peter projected a different image. He lacked the celebrity profile that had dominated newspapers during the 1980s. That lower profile was significant. Many organized crime historians later argued that after the Gotti years, portions of the mafia world sought a return to traditional principles associated with earlier generations. Public attention had become dangerous. Visibility attracted surveillance. Cameras attracted prosecutors. Silence offered survival. Federal investigators had long believed older mafia traditions emphasized invisibility. Carlo Gambino himself reportedly maintained a cautious style that minimized unnecessary exposure. According to multiple documented accounts, this philosophy prioritized discipline and secrecy over publicity. The organization now appeared to be moving in that direction. But the truth was far darker. Because while the Gambino family attempted to reorganize, federal pressure never eased. Throughout the late 1990s and early 2000s, authorities continued pursuing cases against various members and associates connected to organized crime activities. Surveillance operations expanded across New York. Investigators monitored alleged racketeering enterprises tied to construction, labor influence, gambling, and extortion schemes. The environment confronting organized crime no longer resembled earlier decades. Technology changed everything. Electronic surveillance had become more sophisticated than the methods available during earlier mafia eras. Investigators could collect evidence over long periods while slowly assembling criminal conspiracy structures piece by piece. Organized crime groups historically depended on insulation. Layers protected leadership. Associates insulated captains. Captains insulated upper administration. Federal investigators spent years learning how to dismantle those layers, and they became increasingly effective. What investigators discovered next created additional problems for the Gambino hierarchy. According to later federal allegations, tensions surrounding leadership and authority continued inside the organization. Publicly, the Gambino family still projected continuity. Internally, however, legal pressure repeatedly forced structural adjustments. These changes reflected a larger reality affecting American organized crime itself. By the early 21st century, the five families no longer operated in the environment that had allowed earlier generations to flourish. Urban economies changed. Political corruption structures changed. Law enforcement priorities changed. Even the underworld had changed. Traditional mafia influence over labor unions and certain industries faced increasing challenges from both regulation and federal attention. While criminal enterprises certainly continued, prosecutors increasingly disrupted long-term operations through expansive conspiracy investigations. The effect was cumulative. Arrests disrupted relationships. Cooperators generated intelligence. Surveillance created evidence. Leadership continuity became fragile. Then came another major legal turning point. In 1998, John Gotti entered a plea agreement involving racketeering charges and received a prison sentence. Court proceedings surrounding the case represented another major moment for the family. Once again, the Gambinos faced leadership uncertainty. That decision would change everything, because now the organization confronted a familiar problem. Its acting leadership had become compromised, and with John Gotti imprisoned and Junior facing legal consequences, greater authority increasingly moved toward Peter Gotti. Federal authorities eventually identified Peter as the Gambino family's official boss. Yet circumstances surrounding his leadership remained fundamentally different from the era that had made the family internationally famous. The organization he inherited was wounded. Years of prosecutions had altered internal dynamics. Investigators possessed deeper institutional knowledge of mafia operations than ever before. Cooperation agreements had become more common. The psychological environment had shifted. According to documented testimony and organized crime analysis, earlier generations often viewed silence as absolute. But decades of prosecutions introduced another calculation: survival. Long prison sentences changed behavior. RICO cases carried extraordinary legal consequences. Defendants increasingly faced the possibility of spending the remainder of their lives incarcerated. Federal authorities understood this pressure, and they used it. As the early 2000s approached, investigators continued monitoring Gambino activity with extraordinary attention. Authorities had spent years pursuing one central objective: preventing the family from rebuilding the power structure it once possessed. From the government's perspective, leadership transitions created opportunities. Instability generated mistakes. Mistakes generated evidence, and evidence generated cases. Meanwhile, behind prison walls, John Gotti's health had begun deteriorating. In 1998, doctors diagnosed him with throat cancer. Treatment followed. Medical transfers followed. The once highly visible mafia figure who dominated headlines throughout the 1980s increasingly disappeared from public life. The image had changed. The expensive suits were gone. The courthouse crowds were gone. The cameras had faded. Yet investigators still watched carefully, because even weakened organizations could recover, and authorities had spent too many years dismantling the Gambino family to assume the danger had passed. Then, as federal pressure continued building around the organization, events surrounding both leadership and mortality began converging. And what happened next would push the family toward one of the most difficult periods in its modern history. As federal investigators continued watching the Gambino organization, John Gotti's declining health became more than a personal tragedy. It represented the approaching end of an era. The man whose image once dominated New York tabloids and television broadcasts had spent years inside federal custody. The larger concern for authorities, however, remained unchanged: Whether the Gambino family could recover after a decade of prosecutions, leadership disruptions, and structural damage. By the early 2000s, that question was becoming increasingly important. For decades, organized crime families had demonstrated an ability to survive setbacks. Leaders went to prison. Successors emerged. Power shifted. The structure adapted. Federal authorities had learned repeatedly that removing individuals did not necessarily eliminate organizations. But circumstances surrounding the Gambino family looked different. The damage had accumulated over time. Repeated investigations had disrupted leadership continuity. Cooperation agreements had undermined trust. Long prison sentences had altered internal calculations. The organization still existed, but according to prosecutors and organized crime investigators, the environment supporting its historical strength had changed dramatically. On June 10, 2002, John Gotti died at the United States Medical Center for Federal Prisoners in Springfield, Missouri. He was 61 years old. The death marked the conclusion of one of the most public and controversial mafia careers in American history. Media attention followed immediately. News organizations covered the story extensively. The former boss who once stood outside Manhattan courtrooms, surrounded by cameras, now existed as a symbol of a fading criminal era. But behind the headlines, federal authorities focused on another issue: leadership. Because with John Gotti gone, uncertainty surrounding authority inside the family had formally ended. Peter Gotti had become the recognized leader, yet the conditions surrounding his leadership remained extremely difficult. According to federal authorities, investigators continued building cases involving alleged Gambino members and associates connected to racketeering activity. Surveillance remained active. Informants remained valuable. The strategy that had transformed federal organized crime investigations during previous decades continued operating with increasing sophistication. Long-term conspiracy prosecutions remained central. According to court records and law enforcement reporting, authorities increasingly sought cases capable of identifying administration structures rather than isolated criminal acts. Investigators understood that criminal organizations relied upon continuity. Disrupt continuity. Disrupt leadership. Disrupt communication. The organization weakens. That logic guided organized crime enforcement strategies for years. Then another major blow arrived. In 2002, Peter Gotti and numerous others were indicted in a sweeping federal racketeering case. Prosecutors alleged involvement in multiple criminal activities tied to organized crime operations. The case reflected years of investigation and represented another major effort targeting Gambino leadership. Federal authorities argued that the family administration itself had become a prosecutorial target, not merely individual conduct. The structure, the investigation that followed had taken years. Court proceedings eventually resulted in Peter Gotti receiving a lengthy prison sentence. Federal records show he was sentenced to 25 years in prison. For the Gambino family, the pattern had become painfully familiar. Leadership emerged. Pressure followed. Cases followed. Prison followed. The cycle repeated itself, and authorities viewed repetition as success. According to organized crime analysts and former investigators, these prosecutions achieved more than arrests. They generated instability. Stability historically represented one of organized crime's greatest advantages. Hierarchy allowed predictability. Predictability allowed control. But repeated disruptions created uncertainty. Uncertainty created vulnerabilities. Meanwhile, broader conditions surrounding organized crime in New York continued evolving. The city itself had changed substantially compared with earlier decades. Industries historically associated with organized crime influence had transformed. Construction oversight increased. Certain labor structures evolved. Federal scrutiny remained intense. Criminal opportunities still existed. Authorities never claimed organized crime had disappeared. But the environment no longer resembled the New York that allowed earlier mafia generations to build enormous influence. Court records and investigative reporting throughout the early 21st century continued documenting Gambino-related prosecutions involving various members and associates. Operations involving gambling, extortion, loan sharking, and other traditional activities remained subjects of law enforcement attention. Yet according to numerous organized crime experts, the organization's ambitions increasingly appeared smaller than during previous eras. The age of highly visible mafia empires had faded, and federal agencies wanted it to stay that way. Psychologically, investigators believed long-term legal pressure produced effects extending beyond criminal cases themselves. Fear changes organizations. According to law enforcement assessments and testimony gathered over decades, the threat of life sentences altered decision-making. Cooperation became conceivable where previous generations might have considered it impossible. The old certainties no longer seemed absolute. That transformation may have represented the most significant change of all. Historically, mafia structures depended heavily upon internal trust. Members trusted that leadership could protect them. Leaders trusted members to remain silent. But decades of federal prosecutions repeatedly tested those assumptions. And repeated testing eventually creates fractures. By the years following John Gotti's death, the Gambino family still existed. Investigators never suggested otherwise.